This is Amy Howley, Project Evaluator for the Ohio Center for Deafblind Education. I am sorry I am unable to attend the TAD meeting today. I hope this webinar will give you the same information I would have presented in person or by phone. If you have follow-up questions, you might share them with Emily Kresiak, the Word Farmers Associate who is attending the TAD meeting in my place. Or you can email me at the address on the screen, amyhowley@gmail.com. First, I'd like to let everyone know what the Low Incidence Institute entailed. As you may recall, it was a professional development effort with the aim of increasing inclusive practices on behalf of students with low-incidence disabilities, including deafblindness. It involved a 2-day intensive training session in Columbus in June 2014, followed by a 3-hour regional session in September. The major work of the Institute, however, took place in the district leadership team meetings of participating districts. Overall, the PD focused on why and, to a lesser extent, how to create greater inclusiveness for students with low-incidence disabilities. The work of the DLTs involved an assessment, planning, and implementation process. An inventory of practices, the Inclusiveness Profile, helped each DLT conduct a gap analysis to see where its practices fit with or fell short of high standards of inclusiveness. DLTs chose one or more domains of practice from the inventory on which to focus improvement efforts. A diagram showing the theory of action supporting the Low Incidence Institute's efforts appears on this slide. It starts with small changes in practice. These are the changes that DLTs selected to make after using the Inclusiveness Profile to conduct the gap analysis. The idea is that even small changes in practice, when done well, will yield positive results, which, in turn, lead to improved dispositions toward inclusion among educators. With improved dispositions toward inclusion and the history of success with small changes, the district will then be well positioned to make more substantial changes. This theory of action reflects Thomas Guskey's insights about systemic change. The original plan was to include one DLT from each state support team region. SST directors identified the DLTs based on the district's receptivity to inclusion. In some cases, SST directors recommended more than one district, and these DLTs were invited as well. Altogether, 19 districts participated in both the central and quad-level regional trainings. It seemed clear, however, that some of the districts lost momentum, and follow-up data regarding participants' attitudes and districts' inclusive practices was provided by only 13 of the districts. The evaluation made use of 4 measures. The first was a scale purporting to measure attitudes or dispositions toward inclusion. Statistical work with the instrument showed that it had 2 scales, one focusing on attitudes or dispositions toward inclusive practices, and the other focusing on attitudes or dispositions toward exclusive practices. In an ideal world, perhaps, we might assume that the items on the 2 scales would be negatively correlated. In fact, we might assume that they would be so highly correlated that they would form one scale. In practice, though, the negative correlation was not large enough to justify including all of the items on one scale. In common sense terms, this meant that some people with relatively positive attitudes toward inclusiveness nevertheless also had neutral or lukewarm attitudes toward exclusiveness. The other measures were the Inclusiveness Profile that I mentioned previously, and some questions that allowed members of participating DLTs to self-report about the learning associated with participation in the Low Incidence Institute. The pre-assessment was administered in August, and in some cases September, of 2014, and the post-assessment was administered in December of 2014, and in some cases a bit later. So the window for districts to show improvement was relatively small. Nevertheless, there was one statistically significant increase among the items on the scale measuring attitudes toward inclusion. Members of participating DLTs increased their support for the statement, quote, "All students benefit a great deal from interacting with students with low incidence disabilities," unquote. There were no other statistically significant changes among the other attitudes toward inclusiveness items or among the attitudes toward exclusiveness items. As mentioned previously, the profile, which included practices across a wide set of domains, was used formatively for the DLT gap analysis. Its items came from standards of inclusive practice that Elise Fritura, Shauna Benson, and I developed independently and then merged. The large number of applicable domains and the extensive list of practices on the profile gave participating districts a lot of room to select just one or two practices to get started with. The first question that elicited information about self-reported learning asked, "How have your perspectives on the education of students with low incidence disabilities changed in the last 6 months?" Responding DLTs could indicate that their confidence in the value of inclusion had increased, decreased, or stayed the same. As the slide shows, 5 of the 13 responding districts indicated that their DLTs were more confident about the value of inclusion, while the other 8 said their perspectives stayed the same. The second question that asked about learning asked, "To what extent did participation in the LI Institute influence your current thinking about inclusion?" As the slide shows, most saw the Institute as influencing their current thinking, at least to a moderate extent. One open-ended item also allowed participating districts to talk about how the LI Institute had influenced their districts. An analysis of the comments they provided showed increases or sustained uses of inclusion, as well as increased awareness of inclusive practices. 7 comments indicated continued support for the more exclusionary practice of individualization. The major conclusions of the evaluation appear on this slide. First, change of the sort hoped for by the developers of the LI Institute requires more time than the 6 months available for the project. Second, districts vary in their willingness to become more inclusive in their practices. Finally, stereotypes about students with low incidence disabilities persist and seem to be difficult to eradicate. These stereotypes tend to sustain exclusionary practices. The evaluation also allowed for the identification of districts that seem most ready to move forward with the work of creating more inclusive environments for and using more inclusive practices with students who have low incidence disabilities, including deaf-blindness. I was able to generate a list of those districts that met 3 criteria. They showed improvement in attitudes, and they reported increased use of inclusive practices, and they reported that the LI Institute had helped them become more inclusive. Deb has the list of these most receptive districts and will talk about possible plans for involving them in future efforts.